Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning from where you are watching us. Welcome to Karwaan. And today I have a very special guest to do a very special, and for me, it's going to be very unique Karwaan conversation with one of my favorite, Manu S Pillai. Hi, Manu sir, and welcome to Karwaan.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
And I have a copy of your latest book that came out in 2019. I hope all of you can see it. The Courtesan, the Mahatma and the Italian Brahmin, Tales from Indian History. And I was going through it. I think I am on the chapter of Jodhabai right now. I'm a slow reader.
Hmm.
I'm really sorry. And
The so-called Jodhabai. Yeah.
oh God, yeah, yeah. So let me just introduce our speaker, though he doesn't need any introduction. Manu S Pillai is the author of the award-winning book, The Ivory Throne, Chronicles of the House of Travancore, and we'll talk about that in today's conversation. His second book was Rebel Sultan, that came out in 2018 by Juggernaut, the Deccan from Khilji to Shivaji, and most recently the Courtesan, the Mahatma and the Italian Brahmin. And just to let you know all, Mahatma doesn't mean Mahatma Gandhi; it's Mahatma Phule, and that came out in 2019. He was born in Kerala in 1990 and educated at Fergusson College, Pune, and currently at King's College, London. Following the completion of his master's degree, where he presented his thesis on the emergence of religious nationalism in 19th century India, we'll talk about that in today's session as well. In 2011 to 2012, he managed the parliamentary office of Dr. Shashi Tharoor for a very long time and was then an aide to Lord Billy Moria, uh, who is a crossbencher at the House of Lords in London in 2012 to 2013. That same year, he was commissioned by the BBC as a researcher to work with Professor Sunil Khilani on the Incarnation History series, which tells the story of India through 50 great lives. The Ivory Throne is Manu's first book, for which he won the Sahitya Akademi Yuva Puruskar in 2017. So, Manu, can you tell us about how you became a historian and why did you think of becoming a historian?
The process is still an ongoing process in the sense that, technically speaking, I'm still doing my PhD. So there's, the whole academic hat is still being formed. But the interest in history and a desire to relate stories that I had heard, things that I had read, to dig up things, to research, that really began somewhere in my teens, because I do remember that already by the time I was in class 10, for example, I was reading a lot of nonfiction. I was reading a lot of biographies. I was reading a lot of books. I'd moved on very rapidly from fiction, which used to be my main course. That became a sort of dessert piece on the side, whereas the main course quickly changed to nonfiction. And then, at the age of 18, I came across this character who's the protagonist of The Ivory Throne, my first book. And that took a life of its own. And often you find that a lot of books come out of that energy where you discover something, it's a fascinating story. You can see that there's something to be told here. And then that energy really starts consuming you. And I can say, without sounding immodest, that really happened with me, where for 6 years I was quite besotted with, just chasing this story. And it meant a lot. Of course, it was complicated, because at 19, which is when I seriously started turning it into a book project. What do you really know at 19 to do anything about books? You may read a lot of books, but writing books is not the same. It's a different cup of tea. Plus, how on earth do you get to archives in London? How do you access material sitting in American universities? How do you even in India, how do you move around and spend that kind of money when you're 19 years old? So there were some questions like that, but over time it became easier. I began as a student. I cleverly persuaded my parents to send me off to London for my masters, and poor things ended up spending a bomb, but I didn't waste it. I spent all my time working at the archives and researching. So it wasn't, at the end of the day, it wasn't an investment that was bad. Then I came back, worked in Delhi. You mentioned working with Shashi Tharoor. One of the incentives was that being in Delhi for me meant access to the National Archives. So I was, keen primarily. My shifts in career were often determined by what my book needed in any given year. So that happened. And then, at the end of 6 years, I knew there was a book here. And because I didn't go into it with a very clear idea as to what kind of book and, what size it would be and all of that took shape, as I worked on the project through multiple drafts of the book. But because of that, it also turned out to be a humongous book. It's a 700 pager. Even now, when I tell people, I still remember the look on my editor's face. She had read the manuscript on her iPad, and then at a meeting we had after she had signed the contract, after she had confirmed it was being published, she said, "Oh, 150,000 word manuscript," and I said, "No, it's 245,000 words." And now I know why she was stunned, because now my PhD thesis is meant to be 100,000 words. So 245,000 is basically 2.5 PhDs, but it was a rewarding experience. It was not easy. It meant cutting down. You're very young, so you probably know that if you pursue something like this, you end up cutting down a lot on your social life. You end up cutting down on fun things that your contemporaries are doing. And but again, I don't say it in some dramatic way. I still managed to have fun, but I had to really sort of manage my time and be very focused. And the advantage is that I've learned focus since then. And for my subsequent books, it became easier because I'd already picked up most of the skills and sort of gone through the hard process with the first book. So I knew with the other books what exactly I wanted to do. It was much more streamlined. So really, becoming a historian is often, I think, a process. I suspect it's a lifelong process, because you end up sometimes revising your own earlier theses. You revise your own earlier opinions. This often happens because as more and more evidence comes to light, you learn to look at the same thing in a new way. So it's really a lifelong process. I've spent now over a decade in that track, and I hope it will be very many more decades in the future.
Yeah. So one must really learn from Manu to how to write 3 books under 30. So that's quite an achievement for any historian, I think. So your first book tracked the life of a female Maharaja of Travancore, House of Travancore. So in a society and in the field where male heroes and male royals are being talked about, why and how did you think to write about the female Maharaja of Travancore, the
You
last
know,
female Maharaja, I think?
in general, I think it comes out of an appetite to find stories that don't generally get told. So even in the third book, which is in many ways my lightest book, and it's a collection of very short essays that began as a newspaper column. But the idea is, I was always intrigued by these stories. Many of these stories, I don't have the inclination, perhaps, or somebody else has already done it. But you have academics who've really gone deep into the story, but somehow it's not really translated into public recognition, or people talking about these stories in the public as they ought to. And I've discovered that someone has to sort of help bridge it. So someone has to find these stories and tell them. And for me, that basic interest in these forgotten characters, marginalized figures, that was somewhere, it was an appealing idea. Now, sometimes people keep asking me, why is it that you only write about kings, which is not true. My third book has lots of non-kingy courtesans and saints and Dalit heroes and so on. But again, the answer to that was, she may not be marginalized in an economic sense, the protagonist of the Ivory Throne, the last female Maharaja of Travancore, but she was marginalized by gender. Because she was a woman, my family comes from what used to be the princely state of Travancore. So although in school we would read about the national struggle, my grandmother had no connection to that, because in the world that she grew up in, she was about 11 years old when the state was integrated into the Indian Union, and for them it was not really British rule; it was really the Maharaja's rule, and they were not directly connected to that. So that disconnectedness was something that intrigued me. And I started reading up on Travancore, and I started noticing a certain pattern, which is that repeatedly in various books, there'd be the sequence of Maharajas. Then it would hit this 1920s period when this Maharani, or this female ruler, was in power. And then the writers would all quickly sort of, in half a page or a couple of pages, move on to the next and the last Maharaj. And I kept thinking, why is that? Why is it that this particular lady doesn't get the same kind of real estate in the book, in terms of number of pages? Why is it that she's not getting that kind of attention? That question led to some digging up, and very quickly I discovered that asking those questions was starting to upset some people. I began with actually a blog. I collected some basic material, and at the age of 18 or something, I wrote a blog. And it's quite funny now, because today we're very used to trolling, but in 2008 trolling was still a very new thing. And I was this obscure kid sitting in Pune writing about this obscure long lost queen in a blog, a private blog. And then the kind of backlash. I don't know where these people came from, and it got casteist at one level. At one level, it was just, how dare you write these things? How dare you insult the erstwhile Maharajas and all that? And that made me even more determined. I was defiant. I said, wait, if you're getting so rankled by some 18-year-old kid's blog post, what does that mean? That means there's really something to the story here. That
Yeah.
means there's really something I chanced on, and I really want to get to the bottom of this. So that's really how that first book began. And as the journey went on, I discovered that the character was really compelling. This Setu Lakshmi Bai of Travancore was a really interesting figure. Again, I don't say good or bad, but genuinely very interesting. The so-called antagonist of the book, her sister and rival, the junior Maharani, was also a very interesting character. And I thought there's so much court drama, there's so much politics that's happening. The feud between these royal figures mutates and sort of moves into the public realm and actually determines political choices on the ground. It's got a prehistory that goes back into all the way to the early 19th century. There's all kinds of layered stories that were linked to the biographical tale of these two women who were the final Maharanis of Travancore. So it isn't a book that's about palaces and Rolls Royces. It's not that kind of. There are a number of books on Indian royalty. In fact, the cliche is that the princely states were all about dancing girls and palaces and fancy cars. But I mean, this is much more of a deep dive. It goes into local politics, communal relations, gender matters, Victorian attitudes, and how that shaped local culture. All kinds of things. A colonial experience of a state rather than directly ruled India. So we know a lot about directly governed British India, but we don't know about how colonialism played out via the princes in what is called indirectly ruled India. So it was one early sort of contribution to that. And I'm, in a way, it was special. It remains special, not just because it's my first book, but the kind of material, the documents, the archival records, all of that I was ferreting out. There were files that I was touching for the first time. Nobody had touched them in 70 years, and the thrill of that was intoxicating. And in addition to that, it in many ways, people outside Kerala may not know this, but a lot of Trivandrum, historians, etc., they were used to a certain narrative. And
Yeah.
this book was intended, and I like to believe that it succeeded in revising that view to a considerable extent. It also got me into trouble with a bunch of people, but that in today's world, anything you write, I think have to be prepared to face trouble, especially if you're putting it out into the world. There's
That
no
is
running away from that, and that's just one of the perils of the job. Now we have to be prepared to deal with it, and always keep our fingers crossed that it doesn't get to a place where it becomes really dangerous or serious.
Yeah, that is true. Uh, I'll come to other questions later, and because you mentioned trolls, so I think we have to ask this question that the conversations on Indian history take place in formal academic books, but now, as we are moving towards the digital age, there are a couple of debates here and there on Indian history that goes on Twitter, for example. So, and especially WhatsApp forwards too. So, how can these be dealt with, or how can these gaps be bridged to make well-researched, long-form history, popular affairs among the masses, so that these trolls can be controlled, or is there any way for historians, for scholars?
Well, I think masses is not really the audience at the end of the day. Anything that you're communicating, I mean, you can communicate to masses. There are various ways. There's documentaries, televised, fictionalized versions. There's all kinds of other media for that. But if you're talking about books, that to begin with, it narrows the field. Not everybody in the world is a reader, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's not nobody's judging that particular tendency for people not to read. Reading has always been restricted to a select set of people. Some of it is because of economic reasons. At the end of the day, books are expensive. It's not easy. The number of requests I get from kids who say, look, we've really enjoyed some video of yours or whatever, and I'd like to now buy a book, but it's so expensive, what do I do?
Yeah,
And there's no answer to that. How do you reconcile these contradictory things? So at the end of the day, reading is a relatively small population. But what can be done is for writing to be made more accessible. You don't need to expect people. You can't expect people to then rise to the level of the academy. The academy can make an effort to reach out to people and make the writing as accessible as possible. A lot of it is simply that. A lot of it is not that the academic world doesn't have the right approach or the right ideas or whatever. In fact, fascinating ideas, excellent work being done. It's always in that bridging, as you said, that communication that we somehow have a problem. On Twitter and social media, it need not be seen entirely as negative. I've in the past, for example, I had only seen some terrible handles which were completely not just making mistakes. Making mistakes is human. We all make mistakes. It's inevitable. But there were these handles that were deliberately perverting things, misreading things, deliberately sort of twisting things. And that's really, it really rankles, because you see that and you think, why be so malicious? Why would you do this when you clearly know that this is not how something is meant to be read or something is meant to be done? But leaving that aside, there are other handles which do make that effort, which do sort of try and link up to a solid sort of research and try and put things out there in an accessible way. I use more than any social media. I don't use Twitter because everybody fights on Twitter. So I just use it for retweeting and liking and reading what's happening in the world. I don't really actively tweet that much. But I do use Instagram a lot, because one of the reasons I do that is, it's images. Even if you post something on your stories, for example, somebody gets angry and they send you a nasty message. The thing is, because it's sent in private, the rest of the world can't see it. It doesn't turn into this lamba choda Mahabharat where everyone's sort of feuding and fighting with each other and 300 people join, and none of that chaos happens. On posts, of course, people can start fighting, but even then, it's pictures. It's a more sane space. There's more space to sort of explain things. It's not just 180 characters or whatever. So for me, that is the preferred medium. But I think, historians, I suppose, now an older generation, you really can't expect it, because, they may not be familiar with some of these technologies. But younger historians are, I think, slowly reaching out, trying to sort of make use of other platforms. Sometimes they get trolled very, very excessively, all kinds of horrible messages and attacks. But the effort matters. The effort of trying to get out and put this out there is useful. And I think it's one way of trying to reach out to as many people as possible. And of course, we're doing this on YouTube. So, that's another form, right? Now, I may have spent 6 years writing my book, and that's encapsulated in 700 pages. But in the hour that we spend here, if not all of it, some of the core ideas, some of of how I got through that process, some of that can be communicated. And if that is done reasonably well, at least it may whet appetites. People may think, okay, this was interesting. Let me go pick up the book. That's what I tried to do even with the third book, the Courtesan, the Mahatma and the Italian Brahmin. It's short essays precisely because there were these kids who would come and say, look, we're very scared of books. We haven't these big history books. History's always been a dry subject. We're very scared of picking up a 700-page book or whatever. So the idea of short essays where you can choose whichever essay you want, it's not more than 5 pages, is really to woo them in so that they can see that history can be related to. It is not something to be scared of. It is not something that's daunting. And once you cultivate that appetite, once you enjoy it, even in an abbreviated form, then maybe the next time you see a heavy book, you'll think, okay, wait, let me just pick that up and see if that works for me. So, I think, historians have to come up with interesting ways to sort of, reach out to more and more people, especially because so much of it is now being misused and twisted.
So reaching out and leaving academics aside for a moment, and making history accessible to the common man. I think that is a crux of what you said.
Yeah.
And another thing that comes up more occasionally now, that is, thank God to social media, that the historians are some historians are so much so ideologically inclined to one what you can say is one side of the spectrum, and they are writing they are distortions. I think that is what Twitter says now. So what distortion do you think take place when history is told through strong ideological lenses? Or do you think a historian should be or is neutral in the sense, in the way he or she approaches history?
No,
And what impacts does this have on how history and historians are perceived in the public?
one of the things is that historians are also human beings. So as I said, the first thing to do is not to judge people for the mistakes they make. Everybody makes innocent mistakes. There was a very senior scholar who gave a newspaper interview last year, maybe, yeah, somewhere last year. And it was very interesting where he referred to how There was a colonial historian who, for the first time, categorized Indian history into a Hindu period, a Muslim period, and a British period. And he said it was John Stuart Mill. It's actually James Mill. But that was an innocent mistake. John Stuart Mill was also James Mill's son. So it was not like, it was too far off, but it was just an innocent mistake. And mistakes of that kind happen. Sometimes you find that, a scholar will work on one core area, but in introducing the book and building up the narrative, you sometimes have to reach out into other areas as well. And you may make some mistakes there. We all do that. Everybody makes those small mistakes. So to begin with, historians are not like, completely infallible gods or something. They're prone to making the same human errors that everybody else is. The question is it done maliciously or is it done innocently? That's where you can make a distinction between people. Now, on the question of ideology, now the thing is, because historians are also human beings, they're also creatures of their time. A lot of contemporary social mores, a lot of things that are happening around us inform some of our own choices. And I'll give you one example. This is something I mentioned earlier as well. We emphasize, because for good reason, we won independence in 1947, and the emphasis has been on nationalist history after that. Because it was hard-won independence, there was partition, there was insurgency, there were princely states to be united. So the idea was to project a certain kind of history or a narrative that would keep all this together, that would not just legitimize this new democratic republican sort of experiment, but also sort of give it a life of its own through narrative, through telling stories about it.
Yeah.
But that is also a political choice, right? When you make that choice to make sure that history is nationalist, that it doesn't talk too much about religious difference, but talks more about areas where there was religious harmony. These are choices that were made in that time for various reasons. But it's not just religion. So I mentioned the princely states earlier. We have this caricature idea of the princely states, and this is something that comes up in my next book. But you find that no, princely states were not really caricatures. There were major princely states where a lot of interesting things happened. Now, if you want to understand how nationalism evolved, say in a Travancore, it wasn't as it evolved in British India. It had a completely different kind of evolution through communalism, which is why so the Travancore Congress joined the mainstream Indian Congress in British India only around the late 30s.
Yeah.
And then after independence, it again sort of lapsed back into communal factions. And this is something that still afflicts the Congress today as a political party in Kerala. You go to Mysore, you find the same sort of trajectory there. There are communal groups, there's a Brahmin group, there's a non-Brahmin group, all of these come together, and then they sort of join with the Indian National Congress. And why do they join? The Congress needs them to be able to penetrate the princely states. They need the Congress to get a higher profile and to be noticed at a pan-Indian level and to make the Maharaja listen to them. So it wasn't really some kind of altruistic love for the nation kind of an argument that brought these parties together. It was ground politics of very different kinds, but they found a common ground and then they moved on. I was just yesterday reading a new book by Sunil Purushottam, the historian, where he talks about princely Hyderabad. And it's really fascinating. You think of a police operation in Hyderabad, right, to make Hyderabad join the Indian Union. What's interesting is tens of thousands of people are estimated to have been killed in that so-called police operation. The police operation coincided with the United Nations starting to discuss the whole Hyderabad issue. In Hyderabad, state Congress people and Hindu Mahasabha types, there was an overlap between these two groups. It was in Hyderabad that Nathuram Godse, famous as Gandhi's assassin, came to agitate with a bunch of Hindu Mahasabha people and sort of got arrested and all kinds of things happened there. So even looking at that one princely state, you start realizing, hold on, that period, the first half of the 20th century, which we bracket as the freedom struggle, had again layers, had again different things happening in different places and in different ways. So often these, people often say the RSS and the Hindu Mahasabha didn't play a role in the freedom struggle. What's interesting is some of them, just when the Congress was starting to fight against the princely states, a lot of these organizations started supporting the Hindu princely states while agitating against the Nizam and other Muslim states. It also teaches you something about communalism. It also teaches you something about communal history. But the princes have been marginalized as just champagne drinking idiots, in limousines, and you don't really even bother investigating the princely states, which covered about 40% of the Indian landmass. How can you really speak of an Indian history if you're not going to go into that particular period, right? So there's, even with something like that, something that is not really related to Hindu-Muslim communal sort of this thing, you find that there are certain choices that are made. These could be ideological. The Kapil Komireddy wrote a book where he does say that this great anxiety to keep India secular meant that we did sometimes airbrush certain elements that were not pleasant or whatever. But I think the answer to that is not to go to the other extent and then say that everything is distorted, these are distortions, these are, this is all worthless and all this is lies and all of that. That's not the argument either. The argument is to come up with solid research, to come up with new approaches, to come up with a new perspective and to do it well. Name calling is easy. Name calling, we both can sit here and name call all the people we don't like. But that's very easy. The point is, if you really want to make an academic contribution, you have to do it in a compelling way, you have to do it in a rigorous way. Then nobody can question you. This is, again, my first book is related only to Travancore, but it upset so many people. I ended up getting a legal notice for that book. But the thing is, I didn't say anything. It is all in the records. It's all in the research. Everything has a footnote. If you follow a pattern like that, you can make all kinds of revisionist arguments, but it has to stand up to scrutiny. It has to stand up to interrogation. It can't just be visual present day ideology. You attempt to construct legs for it and picking and choosing. No, because then those legs are going to be wobbly. If you want to really make a contribution and say, look, there is something wrong in the way this is done, this has been sort of colored by ideology a little too much, the answer to that is not to bring in your ideology and color it to give it a new color. The answer is to go back to the drawing board, try and see what went wrong, and then construct a narrative in a compelling way. And maybe that will help us resolve this in a much more mature style than otherwise you succumb to the same problem that you criticize other historians of having succumbed
to. Yeah. In I was reading one of your interviews and where you mentioned that finding sources, finding archival material is much easier in Europe than in India. And you mentioned that when you were working with Dr. Tharoor, you were also working at the archives, you were working on your books. And so in India, do you think we do not really respect and protect our archival materials in a way that we should do? And because the condition of the National Archives is not very well, the condition is not good, and there are not many people, those who go and visit and those who research there. So how do you think we can improve the situation? And if you can tell us about that situation.
Well, to begin with, it's not that our archives are not good. It's just that it's often a headache to navigate our archives. So if you go to a Western country, often the systems are streamlined. The systems are easy, so you don't end up wasting time. Whereas often what I found here in our country, whether it was once in the south and once in the north, also two different archives, you go in, you put in a request to wait a certain number of hours. Then when the request is brought, they'll say, oh, this file can't be traced. And I'm like, how is that possible? It's in your catalog, so it must have been in the system. But they're like, no, but it's not traceable now. And that's not really an answer. And you may have come all the way just to look at that particular file, and then it can't be traced, and that's a problem. So sometimes it's really about just, I don't know, perhaps putting people in there who love what they do and they really know what they're doing, as opposed to bureaucrats who are doing it as a job and not something that deserves not just that you do it a certain way, but also a certain amount of heart. You really have to care about these things that you're handling and not just see them as just another job which has been allocated to you for a certain number of years or months. So it really is at some point about an attitude. It really is about funding at another level, which is, are we giving our archives enough funds to hire the right kind of people? If somebody has good training in terms of handling this material, why should they work in an Indian archive if they're getting something much better in, say, another place or a private establishment or something where they get paid better? There are no easy answers to these things, because we do know that in a poor country or in a developing country, there are lots of demands on governmental funds. So it's not always easy to channel things. What is puzzling is we have so many industrialists, we have so many rich people in our country who somehow seem to be happy donating to political parties but won't donate to keeping up these institutions. I find it very curious that on the one hand we want to beat our chest and say, look, we are proud nationalists, we are proud of our country or whatever, and then not care about artifacts being destroyed, old structures being pulled down in some cases, or simply being damaged in some other cases, and archival material rotting away. And it's not that we don't have it. Western countries, of course, Britain, for example, because they took away so much from India, of course, they have a lot. I mean, it's easy to navigate. So I enjoy working there because it doesn't stress you out a lot. But the frank truth is, it's not like they made it. They carted it off from here, a lot of it. But it's not like what we have is small. In one case alone, I was recently doing an essay on the Padmanabhaswamy temple in Trivandrum. There's over 2 million palm leaf records pertaining just to that temple. 2 million, 2.2 million palm leaf records. Just imagine if some kind Malayali industrialist decided to contribute money to just digitize it. All you need to do is digitize it. And then you can even make some of that money back simply by licensing people for whatever. If you want to use it, pay a certain fee, and then you can use it. There's so many archives do that abroad. They digitize everything, and then you can sort of subscribe for a fee and then use it. So, to be fair, certain establishments in India have started doing it. The Asiatic Society in Bombay has an excellent website where all kinds of things archived. Their old collection of books, everything that's out of copyright, newspapers. So if you want to go back to the 19th century and read what was written in the Times of India in 1865 or 1890, you can actually go to the Asiatic Society website, sign up. It's 12,000 rupees or something, which may be a lot for many people, but it's also not that much for 1 year subscription. If you're really serious about it, you can really collect a lot of data out of the material that they have. So yeah, some of it is funding, some of it is attitude, and some of it is, I think, at some level, I think we have such a surplus of historical material in India. We grow up with monuments around us. In Pune, for example, you walk through the city, you see temples all over the place. Peshwa era structures, old structures that are 1,000 years old. Caves, all of that. So at some level, in India, you can't walk a mile without coming into something that is old. And I suspect that at some level, it means that we also don't take it as seriously as we should, because we're so used to it. There's that saying, right? Ghar ki murgi dal barabar. So it's somewhere along that kind of an attitude. I've seen this on my way to the tombs in Golconda in Hyderabad, the Qutub Shahi tombs. There are these smaller sort of tombs, that are not part of the main complex, but sort of strewn in the same overall area. And there were structures that had been built and attached to them. So you almost have, I vividly remember one place which was essentially the drawing room of a house, where they just built a house around this old, Qutub Shahi era structure and combined it. So that structure was a room in their house now. It's just, at one level, it's fascinating that only in India, perhaps, can you see this kind of thing happening in front of your eyes even today. But on the other hand, it's also neglect. It's also complete apathy to it. Again, I don't want to paint everybody with the same brush. There are people trying to do things in a new way, make a difference. You have, people trying, people are digitizing things. Private, organizations are stepping in. There's even companies that are set up just to help old collections revitalize themselves. So there's, I have a friend who runs a company like this where she actually helps people set up museums. So you have all these old things. You have, say, an old, palace that's sort of leaking and breaking down. She can come in and sort of help you set it all up and make it viable, so you can, derive an income from it, so that you can run the place. So, there's things happening. So it's not fair to say that everything is bad. But all the same, yes, I think we still haven't fully woken up to the kind of things we have here. Even in terms of old manuscripts, palm leaf material, I don't think we've fully even dip beyond the surface.
Moving to the next question, your books are much popular among the youth today, and I think all my friends have read your books in University of Delhi. So, you know, what are some of the limitations that you find in the mainstream, quote unquote mainstream education of history in school and university level, and that you think as a historian we should improve upon?
One thing is, again, I'm not entirely sure whether the problem is the textbooks or the teachers, because I don't remember in school having one history teacher who was good. Good in the sense that who made the subject come alive and that kind of thing. There were teachers who did that with other subjects. I remember very clearly my Hindi teacher, of all people. You don't really think of Hindi as comparable to history, but she really made me enjoy Hindi. I was a top scorer in my Hindi exams because the subject was such fun because of the way she taught it. But I don't remember a single history teacher who managed to accomplish the same thing. Part of it is, again, I don't blame them. It's a routine for them. They have to go through this year after year with a bunch of kids, and the kids are not interested, the textbooks are boring, why make an effort? So I suppose at some level there's a degree of boredom and frustration that causes some of this. But on the other hand, I think, again, now with so much technology coming into the picture, it shouldn't be that difficult. Earlier we discussed about social media and other platforms in terms of us and people talking about it, using history, etc. But think of the same technologies in educating children, using videos, using documentaries, creating that kind of material. I think there are companies that are making that kind of educational material, but just imagine the potential that you have if you have somebody able to bring in the research, so you can bring academics on board and a strong team to sort of visualize it, create interesting material for kids. I think that's not a bad possibility. It's definitely in the realm of things that could happen in the coming 10 years. It's not happened to the extent we'd like so far, but I think it will happen. You just need to make sure that the two sets are married, good research, good creative artists and creative types to help visualize that. So yeah, I think, again, I'm not entirely pessimistic. I think in future we may see things being done in a better way. But you're right, in the past, in my growing up years and even in my university education, I wasn't terribly impressed with the kind of resources available to teachers, the kind of effort the teachers made. All the history I enjoyed was through my private reading. It wasn't really through anything that I studied anyway, or anything taught to me by somebody else. It was not that way. I recently did last year, that is during the lockdown, I did an online, Ashoka University was doing a series of online lectures, and I did one course on what was called the world of Indian history. So a sort of broad introduction for a bunch of people. I think there were about 30-40 people in that class. That was great fun because, again, it was simply because I was given the freedom. I was given the freedom to design the curriculum, to use my own sort of ideas there, to structure it in the way that made sense to me. And because of that, I was interested in teaching that course, because it was not some kind of straitjacketed Sarkari formula that I had to follow. I was given the freedom to sort of discuss things in the way I wanted. The themes, so it wasn't, for example, the very first class was about Indian history through clothing, in the sense that we think of clothes as just an everyday object. But if you look at clothes and their evolution, what does it tell you about India's history? So it was just connecting that, which I don't see happening in a regular classroom. I don't see a kid in class 12 or the first day of college sitting down in a class and having that. It's happening in some universities, but it should be, I think, much more broad. It should be thrown open to a lot more people. But again, I'm not pessimistic. I think it will happen in due course. There's no other option. Technology and the education sector will get closer.
Yeah, I think out of all the bad things that happened in 2020, one positive thing that came out of COVID pandemic was the realization that so much can be done through social media in improving the sense of history among the masses. Like we started Karwaan online sessions in April 4th, on April 4th, so it's about to be a
Oh, 1
year.
year. Nice.
Yeah. So I think more and more platforms have come up since there's Ganga Jamuni Foundation and there's many more who are trying to reach out to public. So I think that is one thing that has been a positive of
Yeah.
2020. So moving to some of the final questions now. So, you know, I think you are a writer because there are so many books behind you. So
You
which
have quite a few, by the way. I've been trying to identify the titles. I have this bad habit of trying to do that when I can see somebody with a bookshelf behind them. Anyway, you were saying.
yeah, these are the Indian history titles. These are some novels, I think.
Yeah, I can
So
see Shantaram sitting there. So,
yeah. So can you recommend five favorite titles of non-fiction to our readers?
oh my God, this is something you should have given me warning about. How on earth does one recommend 5 titles? What kind though? That's the thing. You have to really narrow it down, because I simply can't. I simply don't have a favorite book, because there are too many books for anything to be marked as a favorite. There's this in different fields, in different areas. There's just far too much. So you really can't narrow it down. Hmm, what would I say? I really can't think. I mean, 5 books is. I can send it to you in writing after I think about it properly for a time. But because everything I'm thinking of is just recent books that I read. I can't. That's not fair to the earlier
Yeah.
books that I read. So it's not fair to list things I read in the last year. Hmm. I mean, I'll tell you one thing. There was this one, interesting course I did as, before I graduated from college on the side, like a diploma course. And that had a book by a writer called Meera Nanda. She's actually an academic. She used to teach at ISA. Now she's gone to America. It was a book called Prophets Facing Backward. I know people find Meera Nanda a polemical writer, and there are people who sort of get very agitated with her work. But at the age of 18, reading Prophets Facing Backward was really an eye opener to me, because it was about science. It was about, but not about, it wasn't a history of science. It was about social attitudes and science. It was about, how so much of science can also be shaped by prevailing social attitudes in good ways, but also in some very scary bad ways. And I think that is perhaps what introduced me to the idea, long before anybody said it in those terms, but the idea of critical thinking, learning to question, learning that, okay, hold on, this is something you're given, looks reasonable, looks fine, but no, interrogate it, ask questions of it. Why is it written this way? But what about this? So the more you question, you sort of start connecting these dots on your own, and you cultivate a habit of asking more questions, never taking anything simply at face value. It's easier said than done, because at the end of the day, it's not, one can't always ask questions of everything all the time. That will really get very taxing. But in general, it was one book that really made and left an impact on me at that time. Which other book can I think of at that level of impact? I mean, perhaps this is almost nepotistic to say it, but I loved my ex-boss Shashi Tharoor's Great Indian Novel. It was written in 1989. He's written about a dozen books after that. But my favorite still remains that, because I thought it was an excellent blend of epic writing and a basic template from the epics, mixing it with late 20th century politics and sort of creating something that was a hugely enjoyable sort of text. And I think that book will remain a classic for many more years to come. And yeah, I suppose I'll leave it at 2. I don't think I can go all the way till 5 unless you've got another half an hour.
Yeah, we can make 3 by, or recommend all your books: Ivory Throne, Rebel Sultan, and the Courtesan, the Mahatma, and Italian Brahmins. So these are the 5 recommendations from our side to all the readers. So we'll post the links of all the books in the description, so you can check those links out. All the books are available on Amazon, so don't forget to get those books. You did your masters, and the dissertation was on religious nationalism, and in India today we are seeing an upsurge of a certain religious nationalism ideology, and how do you think history plays a role in today's India, when we are faced with shrinking space for dissent maybe, and we are seeing in some university recently somebody was removed, somebody resigned from his post, and there's a whole controversy. So how do you see the role of history here?
I mean, that's the interesting thing, right? These rival ideologies always try to pump history to find backing for their claims. You always try. I mean, one of the reasons why so many historians and very eminent historians, look, as I said, you can criticize their work, but you have to criticize it a certain way. You have to show what is wrong in the argument. You have to argue it a certain way. You really have to back it up. That is fine. You can criticize people's work, etc. But the kind of vitriol, the kind of attacks, the vehemence with which this kind of thing is done against, the biggest name is Romila Thapar. People just seem to somehow have decided that she's far from the great icon that she has been presented to be, is some kind of villainess of Indian history or whatever, which is simply not true. I mean, you can have quibbles about certain conclusions, you can fight over certain arguments, but the kind of work that has been done is just humongous. You really can't try and devalue that. So, but that's the thing, right? These ideologies use this kind of personal attack to devalue the work historians have done, so as to make it seem like, but this is not just specific to India. Everywhere around the world at the moment, and it's interesting that it should happen in the previous decade, you find that the way this functions is you reduce trust. You reduce trust in institutions, you reduce trust in newspapers, you reduce trust in writers and historians. You try and sort of make the world think, make people think that these people can't be trusted. They all have an agenda, they're all part of some conspiracy, they're all part of something, this thing, they're the ones who kept you down, this is not the real thing. for me, that's a very weak thing, and it can't go too far. Now, I don't know, it's scary though, but I don't think it clearly must have a shelf life. Lies can't really carry on forever. Again, who knows? Maybe I'm just too optimistic and saying these things, but I think we'll come out of this. I think we will go beyond this, simply because I don't see how this thing can be sustained. You can tell lies till everyone's heard it, but after the one or two rounds of that, people start realizing, hold on, this doesn't quite add up. And the thing is, you can believe a lot of things so long as it doesn't touch you, but the moment it starts touching your everyday life, you start waking up and going back to slightly more sensible ways of behaving.
Hmm.
So again, there is a lot of ideology, there is a lot of name calling. Frankly, I wish it was just ideology, but this is just name calling. A lot of it is name calling and vilifying and all that, which is stupid. There's no other word for it. It's just idiotic. We'll have to deal with it. As I said, one answer to dealing with it is to make historical research more accessible, make historical writing more accessible, make
Hmm.
an effort to go out and talk to people. And I don't mean to go out onto the street and talk to people. Even our conversation here, whoever views this, they'll at least engage in some of these discussions. They may not agree with everything, but at least they'll understand where I'm coming from, where you're coming from, and hopefully that will have some kind of an impact. So yeah, there is a lot of negative press around writing history at the moment, and historians are seen as some kind of fifth column in the country, trying to destabilize the country and all that. But yeah, I think we can leave that as a joke, and really treat it as a joke, because frankly, that's the treatment it deserves.
That is true. And you have written in your introduction to this book that we live in times. This is the first line of the introduction, and I am reading it out from the book. We live in times when history is polarizing. It has become to some an instrument of vengeance for grievances imagined or real. Others remind us to draw wisdom from the past, not fury and rage. Seeing it in the chronicles of mosaic of experience to nourish our mind and recall without veneration the confident glories of our ancestors. So I think that is very important to understand for all of us as history students, as normal, as common people, as lay people. We have to understand this.
I mean, it's a simple fact. History. When you think of history, and golden ages and all that, there was no golden age. These are things we ascribe certain values to things in the past, and we think that somehow the time before us was some kind of wonderful time, and it's all been ruined because some enemy came and destroyed it, and therefore we must push out the enemy and everything will be back to golden age. But no, that's really not a historical fact. It's not. It doesn't make any historical sense. uh, we have to just learn to be mature about history. There are going to be good things, there are going to be bad things, and frankly, those things happened many, many years ago. It helped make our society, but that doesn't mean our society's sole destiny or purpose for existing is to go back and fight those battles in the 21st century. That's, I think, a myopic way of looking at it. I think we just have to cultivate maturity when looking at the past, instead of being thin-skinned and sort of jumping at all kinds of provocations. And yeah, I think and we must learn to fight our battles wisely. One reason I don't get into Twitter fights is because, I'm sorry, there's too much to do in the world. My time is valuable, my mind and my peace is valuable. I far prefer using my time and energy to work, not get into these pointless battles on Twitter. Which is not to say people finding those battles are doing something worthless. In fact, some people, because they're battling, it gives me the freedom to not focus on any of that. But yeah, it's not my cup of tea. I'm quite happy putting out books. Even if only 5 people read it, it'll sit on a shelf for 30, 40 years. And even if somebody picks it up 40 years and says 40 years into the future and says there was value to this, it sort of serves a purpose. A tweet is a very immediate sort of thing. In that moment you may feel like fighting and sort of getting onto that, but I think books have the advantage of lasting for longer periods, and I would very conservatively try to stick to that old-fashioned attitude rather than get too distracted by these things that are happening around us.
Yeah, so I think a historian have a major social responsibility towards people of India and towards people of a certain nation where he belongs to or she belongs to, and he preserves and protects the heritage. And I think everybody should respect that and even question that in much more civilized manner.
Yeah,
With
but I would only qualify it by saying that it doesn't mean the people can dictate what historians need to do. In the sense that sometimes you need a certain kind of expertise to do it. You need training. As I said, practice keeps making you better at it. It's always a learning process. So you can't have, just because it's 50 people against one, it doesn't make the 50 right. Right? Sometimes the 50 are wrong, and you need that one person who's trained to be able to say, look, you're being wrong here. So it's
Yes.
not about, while there is a certain responsibility in communicating what they're doing to a larger audience, it doesn't mean that every bit of a large section coming in and yelling and demanding that you do something this way doesn't mean historians will have to bow to that, because that's not their job either. Their job is to stay true to the field. That is really where they must focus. The only extra bit is trying to communicate and sort of clarify that field a little bit for a larger audience, so that that larger audience doesn't get wooed by another set that is screaming and yelling and wants to cut off people's heads and all of that.
That is very true. As you
I
said,
can't believe, I'm sorry, I can't believe I actually said cut off our heads, but frankly, it's happening. There have been death threats that have been made against a historian recently. And, increasingly, if 5 years ago, it would have been exaggeration, but clearly not anymore.
yeah, as you said, there is a training involved in being a historian, and I think people should respect that. And I think there will be much more awareness after conversations like these with historians. And um, as we move toward the end of our conversation, I think this is one of the most memorable conversations that I have had in the last 1 year of Karwaan. And uh, what one sage wisdom that you wish to give to our young readers and writers who are planning to write and read historical books and history books?
Read very widely, read a lot, and don't just read subject stuff or books that are connected just to your field. One of the ways of expanding your mind and learning new things, bringing new perspectives even to your field, is to expand and sort of read a lot more. Frankly, the more you read, the better your writing also gets, because a lot of this is it is about practice. It is about sort of keeping that thing constantly in your mind going, that look, I'm also learning constantly. It's not
Yeah,
like you one fine day you wake up and you discover, okay, now I'm a good writer, that's it, I don't need to bother anymore. But no, you really have to keep bothering. And yeah, the more you read, the better you get at what you do. The more you read, the more you know where to look, the more you know, the more you can identify weaknesses in your own argument, the more you can identify that everything that I'm saying, even the choice of every word, right, is very interesting. Sometimes that's exactly what happens in the editing phase of a book. If it's a historical work and you're making certain statements, there are certain words that have meanings that you may not intend it in that way, but a reader might take it in a different way. So every word ends up being weighed again in your mind, and you keep thinking, is this word okay here, or should I use another word? Because what if it gets interpreted a certain other way? What if there's something that I'm stating with a degree of confidence, but I can't state with finality? I can't use a word that suggests finality. It has to sort of, that whatever wording is in that sentence has to suggest that ambiguity, because the result of my findings are ambiguous in that particular area. So yeah, it is about a lot of these things, but that comes from reading very widely, and not limiting yourself in terms of what kind of material to read. Sometimes it's also useful to read what people you don't like are writing, because it helps open up a side of things that may not have crossed your mind. And I must confess, there are some interesting handles that I follow on Twitter. Somebody once asked me recently, why are you following these right-wing handles? And I said, actually, they're putting it in a decent way. They're not yelling, they're not screaming, they're not abusing anybody, but they're putting out their opinion on these things. And I find that is interesting for me to hear, because next time I'm writing something, I'll have it in the back of my head, and I will know how to address it. I will know how to sort of make sense of it, and not just write for people who have already been converted to sort of my kind of whatever, but also try and see if I can engage with somebody who doesn't believe in whatever I'm trying to propound or put out there. So it's interesting. You keep your eye open even for negative, in quotes, things, even for things that you don't like or things that you don't agree with. So long as I said, so long as nobody's calling you names and being nasty, it's always interesting. You can always learn something from people who are not like you. And it's the
that is
same whether it's books, whether it's people. You end up benefiting from that open-mindedness.
that is really something that we should learn from this conversation. Civilizational debates. Um, I remember a historian was telling me that, in India's culture, this saying that, ekam sat bahuda vipra vadanti. I think if I have said that correctly, that there's one truth and people perceive it differently, and we have to respect all those different opinions. So one thing that we all should learn from this conversation is accepting different opinions and respecting them, and putting that out in a more civilized way, because we have been seeing these Twitter fights all over, and in recent past. So I think that
Yeah,
is a very,
if
yeah,
only we learn to speak with a certain amount of respect to each other, I think we can get through some of these things. But again, some people just don't want to do that. Some people are in it because it's almost a cottage industry to yell and scream and do that. And to be honest, there are people on both sides who behave that way, and I think that also needs to be corrected. There's a certain one of the negative sides of social media is that it also makes people very performative. You think you have to sound witty and you have to sound smart, and when somebody says something you don't like, you have to give a response that's equally sharp, and there's all this like unnecessary pressure that it causes. Whereas frankly, if you just sit down and discuss it without bothering about those things, it becomes a healthier affair for all parties involved, including for people who are just reading it. So yeah, I think you're right. If people just learn to be a little more open-minded towards each other, I think in our country it's not a lost cause. I think we'll still find that we have a lot of common areas. We still have a lot of things that can be used to bridge these so-called polarizing debates. They're polarized because nobody seems to be interested in trying to bridge them. But it's a tough ask. It's not easy, and it'll probably take some years before we see something in that direction.
yeah. I think this is a very good point to end our conversation this evening. And I won't go into the question of asking you, because I have read somewhere that you believe in the superstition that you don't disclose about your future projects and what
Well,
you're
I
currently
actually
working
already
on.
disclosed earlier on this during our chat that my next book is on the princely state. So I
Yeah.
suppose I can't really hold up my superstition anymore. But to be fair, the book is also done. It's in edit. It's going through the edits and that entire phase. So the superstition is don't talk about a book till it's written, which
Yeah.
I think is reasonable. Why go around talking about something that's not done? But now that the book is written, I'm a little more relieved, and my superstition doesn't have its hold on me as usual.
Yeah, so there's a big reveal on our platform that, Manu's next book is coming very soon, and we are really waiting for that. And all the best, sir, for your PhD. I heard you have given your PhD. You have submitted your PhD very
No,
recently.
I've got another year. I had something called a mini viva, which is like a halfway mark where they check whether you've been doing everything okay so far. And then you get sort of upgraded to full PhD sort of status. Then I've got another year to write my actual thesis. So that lies ahead. So I've got
Oh, that's
another year
great.
and a half of work. But thank you for it. Fingers crossed. And
Yeah.
yeah, thank you for the conversation. This took a lot of months to plan, but I'm glad we finally got to sit face to face, via computers and do this at last.
Yeah, finally. And those who are watching us right now, please do subscribe to Karwaan. There's a red button, very beautiful button. Just click on this. There is a ghanti. Please ring that bell, and you'll get all the notifications from Karwaan. And this was the second episode of Karwaan Conversation. We'll bring more and more conversations with historians, with writers, with authors to you all on our platform. Thank you so much, and do check out our other videos that are there. Thank you so much. And thank you so much, Manu, for taking out time for doing this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.